We use the word self in many different ways, and they really are different, and we don't recognize how the term is kind of sliding across topics. So in one sense, selves are clearly not an illusion. I mean, when I say the self is an illusion, I'm not saying that people are illusions. The self that is considered an illusion from the point of view of meditation and can be discovered to be such and felt to be such, and that can actually change the way you feel as a person in the world. It's not a matter of discovering that people don't exist. It's a matter of discovering that the feeling that you have of being a subject interior to the body, you're in your head, behind your face, riding around in your body as though it were a vehicle. This is the self that most people think they have. Most people don't feel identical to their persons. They don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they're, and to put, I think Paul Bloom uses this phrase, people are common sense dualists, where they feel like they're riding around as minds, as subjects inside the body, and they feel like they are the thinker of their thoughts, and that the thinker is something independent of the next thought just arising in consciousness. And they feel like they're an experiencer in the center of their experience rather than being merely identical to a sphere of experience. I mean, another word for this is the ego, the sense of there being a subject. And so that's the thing that is interrogated by a technique like meditation, and if done correctly, that's the thing that can be discovered to be absent, and it can be discovered in a way that's actually not paradoxical. I mean, you can talk about it in a way that can maybe sound paradoxical. You can say, well, how can the subject discover itself to be absent? But, well, the subject is an illusion. The subject is absent, right? This subject. Consciousness isn't an illusion. Thoughts aren't illusions. Perceptions aren't illusions. All those things are actually appearing, but this felt sense that there's a center and an unchanging center in the middle of it, to whom all of that refers, which is appropriating experience in each moment, as though from outside of experience. That's the thing that can be undone through meditation. And then many things follow from that. Everything to be noticed has to first appear in consciousness. I mean, to notice a sensation, to notice a thought, to notice a mood, it has to appear before the floodlights of consciousness. And the self, this feeling of self, is also appearing in some way. It has to have some signature. It has to feel like something to be I. I feels like something. Otherwise, we wouldn't use this word in this way. We wouldn't find it inscrutable to hear that there's no such thing as the self. And yet, by virtue of appearing in consciousness, that proves that consciousness is, in some sense, prior to it and transcendent of it. I mean, so it's just as you can see an object across the room, and by virtue of seeing it, not feel identical to it. And just as you can hear a sound, and by virtue of hearing it, having it appear as an object in consciousness, you realize that consciousness is prior to it. And just as you can see a thought arise and realize that, well, you're not identical to the thought because there it is. It's just a bit of language or just an image, and consciousness is over here prior to it. Well, so too with this feeling of self. That has to be appearing in some way. Otherwise, you would never claim to feel it. And again, this is not a way of having the experience. This is just a way of conceptually understanding it. Consciousness that is the feeler. It doesn't feel like a self because the thing that feels like a self is yet another thing that's appearing. It's a kind of contraction. It's a sensation in your face. It's a sensation in your chest. It's something. It's some signature by which you are reading this sense of I into a condition which is actually unstructured by that. It's just a sphere of experience where things are coming and going in every channel of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, and other sensations as well. You can add proprioception and perhaps other things we don't have names for, but there's just this flux without a center. The center is only implied. And when you look for the center, the feeling of there being a center can then genuinely drop out, and yet everything else remains. There's still sights and sounds, sensations, feelings, and thoughts. Everything that's particular to you is just being brought before the light of consciousness, and it's being known in the only place it can be known, where and as you are, as you. But this point of view of being, of just knowing, is truly generic and truly interchangeable. And it's, the only thing that's personal about you and your memories is just that collection of stuff that is changing over time where and as you are experiencing it. And that's the only place it can be experienced. But consciousness itself doesn't have this personal quality to it. I mean, that gets deconstructed in Buddhist thought in other ways. And there's this concept of emptiness, which is relevant here, where if you look at the evidence of your body and mind for something solid and unchanging that's really you, well, then you don't find it. I mean, you just find this flux. You find either your body changing over time. You find your mind populated by stuff that you didn't author. That's just the fact that you follow the rules of grammar. It's just not something that you started. You have phrases that got into your head that now you use, and you don't know where they came from. And in some ways, you're less similar with prior states of yourself than you are to other people in some respects, given that you've changed in various ways. And there might be periods in Derek Parfit goes into some of this stuff. These are paradoxes of identity, where you might remember something in your past very clearly, let's say when you're at age 4, but just not from when you were 19, say. And so how do you make sense of the fact that you have 0 episodic memories from that 1 year of your life, but you have them from another, which is more yourself? But the crucial issue of selflessness from a meditative perspective isn't at that coarse-grained level of thinking about personal identity and trying to make it square with physics or with change or with anything else. It's this feeling, or its absence, of representing yourself in the world as this inner subject, as the thinker of thoughts, or ceasing to do that, and then being free of that feeling. And being free of that feeling has psychological consequences. And whether that happens for a second or an hour, there's a difference between being stable in this feeling or its absence, or just having brief glimpses of it. And then much of what is claimed to be transformative about meditation follows from there. I mean, that becomes relevant to the increasingly highfalutin claims people make about the promise of meditation and things like enlightenment and Buddhahood and all the other things that begin to sound like religion. But there is something fairly radical to be understood here that is as clear and as on the surface as something like the optic blind spot. Whereas like if you didn't know about the blind spot and you'd never been taught to glimpse it, you would have no idea that this thing exists. But the moment someone shows you how to look for it, and then you see it, well, then it's undeniable, right? There's this part of your visual field that you are just not getting information from, and it's just not obvious to you. And this tricky technique has now proven this to you. And then you really can't be in doubt about it. And if ever you're in doubt about it, you just have to look again, and then you resolve your doubts. Meditation does offer that kind of clarity with respect to this feeling of self, where you thought something was there, and then you look, and it was clearly not there, and your finding it not to be there makes it no longer feel like it's there, right? It's not like it still feels like it's there, but I know conceptually it's not there. No, it's actually not there. There's no distance. There's no sense of being a seer on one side with the object of consciousness on the other. It just collapses. And again, this happens for people in the beginning. This happens very briefly. When things really start humming on a meditation retreat, and you're kind of in the flow of mindfulness and it becomes effortless, that can characterize much longer stretches of experience where there's just a sense of just phenomenon arising. And so that's also synonymous with not conceptualizing experience. You're in contact with raw sensation rather than thinking about your hand. For instance, a hand as a concept, as a matter of experience, you're just down on the level of tingling and vibration and temperature. And so it can be very kind of laser-like, but there is a very similar but kind of more radical, and I would argue more useful insight, which is when you turn that quality of attention on this feeling of being a self itself, so you turn it back on the subject, the mind can kind of go into a failure mode there where you look for the thing that's looking and you don't find it, but the not finding is really conclusive, right? It's not paradoxical. It's not a struggle. It's not like, oh, was that it? Did I see something? No, there's a turning which affects, you look for this sense of self and it drops away. And then what is left is the totality of everything else that's in consciousness, but it is the experience of consciousness without a center. And that's not the same thing as saying, well, now I'm identical to the universe, although I can understand how people, in the context of a religious interpretation or a New Age interpretation of an experience like this, start talking that way. But it is only the world remains on some level, or only consciousness and all of its objects remains, and there is no I in the middle of it. And the moment there seems to be an I, what is actually happening there, once again, you are thinking without knowing that you're thinking. You're lost in thought. The sense of being the one who is meditating or the one who's being mindful, the sense of being this subject, yes, it is an uninspected thought on some level in each moment. There's a kind of an undercurrent of still conceptualizing experience and thinking about experience, even when you think you're being mindful of thoughts themselves, that's going uninspected. And that's kind of the structure of it. In the beginning, you can become less of a dick long before you have an insight into selflessness just by learning to be mindful and being committed to that. So when you look at the things psychologically that cause you to be a dick, right, that cause you to act out, that cause you to let's say, if you feel angry, to helplessly express your anger in relationship, no matter how inappropriate. What that is a fundamental lack of mindfulness. In the worst case, you're not even aware of becoming angry until the words fly out of your mouth, and there's no possibility of being otherwise, right? You see no choice. There's no pause to take because this thing broke over you like a wave and, everything got wet. So basic mindfulness, even mindfulness that really hasn't revealed much of anything of interest to you psychologically or contemplatively, still gives you some kind of two categories of experience. You can be angry and totally lost in it, or you can be aware of anger as a kind of an energy state of your body or an arising emotion, which you then can either act out or be motivated to act by, or you can observe as just a change in your person. And the observing mode is different and leads to different consequences. It leads you to pause before saying something. But as you get better and better at that, what you begin to notice is that all of these negative emotions have a very short half-life. It's impossible to actually stay angry for any significant amount of time, much less be motivated to derange your life or relationships on its basis, without continually being lost in thought about why you should be angry or why you have every right to be angry. You have to stay lost in thought. You literally have to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. It's like going back to sleep and getting back into the dream to be angry at one of your dream characters. You have to do that or let it be done to you over and over again in order to stay in this state. And the moment you become sufficiently mindful, and again, this can happen long before any of what I said about selflessness would make sense, you can discover the half-life of negative emotions to be really short, and then you're given some kind of choice where you can say, well, is it worth being angry here? Is there some ethical purpose served by expressing anger? Or is this just me screwing up my life? I'm not holding myself up as someone who has taken this to anything like its ultimate fulfillment. I can speak honestly about the range of my experience, but my experience is not of being stably in this place of seeing through the arising of every thought and every emotion. Nothing like it. The minority of my time is spent clearly experiencing what I'm talking about, and most of my time I'm lost in thought the way everyone is lost in thought. The difference is, and this is a very significant difference in one's mindfulness practice, is that you can spend a lot of time meditating, literally years on silent retreat, and never clearly realize that you can experience selflessness in every moment of even ordinary awareness. Off retreat, when you were just distracted, you're just watching a movie, nothing particularly meditative's going on. You can cut through to the clarity of selflessness every bit as much there as you can in the most sublime moment in the middle of a 3-month retreat when you've been doing nothing but meditate 18 hours a day, and your experience of the world is completely psychedelic in its diaphanous sense of just, everything is just bleeding into everything else, and there's just no substantiality to be found anywhere. There's an experience that equalizes those two. You're just grabbing more popcorn at the movie, and you feel like Jesus about to deliver the Sermon on the Mount because you feel so good and you love all sentient beings everywhere. Both of those experiences are centerless. Both of those experiences are just as good as the other for recognizing this thing about the illusoriness of the self. And that can take a long time to experience that, and you have to sort of just be lucky, I think. There's a kind of normative ethics that begins to creep in the moment you put this kind of sense of self in question, and the moment you begin to be aware of the half-life of both negative and positive emotions, and the moment you begin to become aware that the thing you were looking for in experience so avidly, the gratification of desire, that isn't really a durable basis of well-being. One of the punchlines of Buddhism being that life is suffering. It's not quite the punchline. The punchline is more that life is unsatisfactory. The difference is, and the word here, the Pali word here is dukkha, and it's not that life is just a reliable circumstance of misery. It's easy to get that from Buddhism as well, because there's an emphasis on how bad things can go, but it doesn't deny that there are different levels of happiness and that some of this happiness can be quite sublime. But because experience is always changing, because there is no stability, to go into this domain of experience seeking stability, seeking to never have any more problems, seeking to scratch an itch and to have it stay scratched, that's a misapprehension. That is bound to be frustrated. So if you're seeking stability in a condition which is by definition not stable, you will suffer. The thing you are clinging to will fall apart in your hands, and you'll get more of the thing you thought you were successfully keeping away. And so that this flux of pleasant and unpleasant experience is going to keep coming, and you, in seeking to only have one and none of the other, you are actually at war with a circumstance that you can't change. And so that changing your attitude toward that is part of the program. But again, mindfulness of its nature changes one's attitude toward that. Because a strong reaction to pleasantness, a grasping reaction, like, oh, I want more of this, or I want to keep this, or a strong reaction to unpleasantness, just aversion, like keep this away, that is what you're canceling when you're being mindful, when you're training in that kind of meditation. And that has ethical implications, because you're no longer trying to control experience in quite the same way. Just to give you the Buddhist view here, they would fully acknowledge that there are many conventional kinds of happiness that are real forms of happiness. They just happen to be impermanent. They end of their own accord. People go to sleep at night, or people suddenly get a pain in their knee and things change, or people die, so there's nothing's permanent there. Nothing is truly stable, but they wouldn't dispute that there are deeper or higher levels of pleasure to be experienced in this world, which it certainly makes sense to want, and it makes sense to want some more than others. And you can kind of climb this ladder to the point where, life could get so good under this view that, well, now you're just noticing increments of better where, you're kind of living in a kind of paradise. But still, on the Buddhist view, if you look very closely, right, you'll see that there's an instability here. You can't maintain it perfectly. And the work you're doing to maintain it in certain respects is based on an uninspected error. And there's actually more pleasure awaiting you as a conscious being to change the game, and to kind of equalize your experience so that you're no longer holding on to things when they change and end, so that you're actually, you can savor moments of experience which now wouldn't strike you as worth savoring, that they're not actually beautiful to you yet, but beauty is largely in the eye of the beholder here, and you could actually be as satisfied with the next moment of experience that you wouldn't single out as being, something you were trying to maximize or create. I mean, so it's only in the kind of its highest mode that it seems to level all distinctions between experience. You talk about somebody who doesn't really care about the difference between pleasure and pain, right? But until you got there as a meditator, well, then there's nothing wrong with sort of climbing this ladder of sublime experiences where you recognize that having quality time with your daughter is better than squandering it bickering or just being lost in your devices. I mean, there's lots of teachings about skillful means and wise uses of attention. And I mean, this is why on the Buddhist view you would ever bother to live an ethical life, because it actually is a kind of raft that you get in to cross a river. And it is really the thing you need to cross the river. But, on the Buddhist view, you then, when you cross the river, you don't pick up the raft and carry it on your head. Where we're at, yes, of course, we're going to make distinctions between better and worse experiences. That's really the only rational thing to do, given how good life can be and how needlessly bad it can be if we don't do it.